That which exists is as it should be. That which should not exist will not do so. The question of whether or not Wujud is an accident that occurred to Mahiyyah puzzled philosophers after Ibn Sina. Ibn Sina was criticized by Fakhry and other later Muslim philosophers for referring to Wujud as an accident, and some philosophers took this to mean that Wujud is an accident that happens to Mahiyyah. Insurmountable issues arise if one interprets accident in the common sense, for example, as a color being an accident and the wood that bears the color being the substance upon which the accident alights from the outside. In the case of the wood, which serves as the locus of the accident, the substance is present whether or not the accident takes place. Whether painted red or blue, the wood retains its natural characteristics and has a physical existence of its own. The accident of color only develops in the wood later, but the wood in its own has a subsistence. In the case of Wujud, the question of what condition the Mahiyyah would be in before the accident of Wujud would come up. If something is already existing, then Wujud must have occurred to it at some point in the past, and the argument could go on ad infinitum. Mahiyyah could not possess any reality if it were non-existent, such as that of wood that would later be painted red or blue. This kind of Ibn Sina's interpretation, which would take accident in the context of Wujud to mean the same as the common understanding of the word accident, is partially attributable to the fact that Ibn Sina didn't fully define the use of the term arad or accident as employed in relation to Wujud. However, Ibn Sina makes it clear that he doesn't mean accident in relation to substance as is typically understood when he uses the term arad in relation to Wujud and Mahiyyah, and he asserts categorically that Wujud is an arad only in a very special sense. Ibn Sina asserts, the existence of all accidents in themselves is their existence for their substrata, except only one accident, which is existence. This difference is due to the fact that all other accidents, in order to become existent, need each a substratum which is already existent by itself, while existence doesn't require any existence in order to become existent. Thus, it is not proper to say that its existence, it as the existence of this particular accident called existence in a substratum, is its very existence, meaning thereby that existence has existence other than itself in the same way as an accident like whiteness has existence. That which can properly be said about the accident existence is, on the contrary, that its existence in a substratum is the very existence of that substratum. As for every accident other than existence, its existence in a substratum is the existence of that accident. The most important thing to keep in mind is that the entire analysis is conceptual and not grounded in the external reality, where Mahiyyah is never found without Wujud. Ibn Sina's intentions were fully known to Nasruddin Tusi when he wrote, Quiddity can never be independent of existence except in the intellect. This, however, should not be taken as meaning that quiddity in the intellect is separated from existence, because being in the intellect is itself a kind of existence, namely mental existence, just as being in the external world is external existence. The above statement that Mahiyyah is separated from Wujud in the intellect must be understood in the sense that the intellect is of such a nature that it can observe quiddity alone without considering its existence. Not considering something is not the same as considering it to be non-existent. It is important to keep in mind that Mahiyyah can be thought of solely as itself, or as the intellect analyzes the nature of reality in itself and not in the external world, to which Wujud is then added or occurs from the outside. In order to comprehend the accidentality of Wujud as understood in the later tradition of Islamic philosophy that followed Ibn Sina's teaching. However, according to the school of the principiality of Wujud, it is actually the Mahiyyat that are added to or occur in Wujud in the outside world. Mahiyyat must be understood as intrinsic limitations or determinations of Wujud rather than as extrinsic ones that have no independent existence and only relate to Wujud, which is the only entity capable of existing. The distinction between necessity, contingency or possibility, and impossibility is one of the core ideas in the Islamic philosophy of Wujud. The term the three directions is commonly used to refer to this distinction, which was again first put forth by Ibn Sina and stated in many of his works. It is essential to comprehending Islamic metaphysics. It actually has both philosophical and theological significance, as evidenced by the fact that Islamic theologians, Sufis, jurists have frequently used the term Wajibul Wujud, the necessary being, a philosophical term for God, throughout the centuries. One of three things would apply if one were to think of a Mahiyyah in itself in the container of the mind. First, it might or might not exist. There would be no logical contradiction in either scenario. Second, it must exist because there would be a logical contradiction if it didn't. Third, it is impossible because if it did, a logical contradiction would result. Mumkin, Wajib, and Mumtani are the names of the first, second, and third categories, respectively. Mahiyyat, like the Mahiyyah of the horse, star, or man, are almost universally mumkin. No logical contradiction exists once the Mahiyyah of man is considered in its entirety in the mind, regardless of whether it possesses wujud or not. The word, or everything that is other than God, is frequently referred to as the word of contingencies, because everything in the created order actually participates in the condition of contingency. Additionally, the mind, or more precisely Aql, has the capacity to conceive of certain Mahiyyat, the supposition of whose existence would involve a logical contradiction. The standard example in traditional Islamic thought is a partner taken unto God. Another example can be given, such as quantity that would be quantitatively greater than the sum of its parts, since the supposition of that which is impossible in reality is not itself impossible. Finally, the mind can conceive of a Mahiyyah that must possess wujud of necessity, that Mahiyyah being one that is itself wujud. The necessary being or wajibul wujud is the name given to that reality whose Mahiyyah is wujud, since it cannot not be. Furthermore, a great deal of evidence has been offered to support the Quranic doctrine of the oneness of God, which states that there can only be one wajibul wujud. In the most fundamental sense, God alone possesses the qualities of necessity and freedom. God as the necessary being is none other than wujud itself. The outside world, where objects already possess wujud, may appear to contradict the analysis done in the container of the mind. Can it be said that they are still contingent? This question becomes especially relevant when one considers that most schools of Islamic philosophy hold that what exists must exist and cannot not exist. The distinction between an object in its essence and in its external manifestation is key to finding the answer to this issue. As a Mahiyyah, every object besides God is contingent in and of itself, a mumkinul wujud. But now that it has gained wujud, it is inescapably dependent on the agency of a reality other than itself in order for it to exist. Therefore, existence are wajib bil ghair, or necessary by a force other than themselves. They are necessary as existence by virtue of having wujud, but they are contingent in their nature as opposed to the necessary being that is necessary in its own being and not through an agent outside of being. A vision of the cosmos that is perfectly in line with Islam's view that God alone possesses the ability to create and to existentiate is made possible by the distinction between necessity and contingency. It is He who commands be in the sense of not possessing any wujud of its own. Everything in the cosmos is in principle pu. The Mahiyyat are only given wujud by the necessary being, who also transforms them from non-existence into wujud by dressing a robe of necessity over them. Otherwise, they will be always in the state of contingency. Thank you so much for watching. See you next time.